Ever been so sure you're right that you'd bet your life on it? Some mad scientists did. Drinking vomit, electrocuting themselves, even leaping off the Eiffel Tower, all in the name of science. Forget safety regulations, these are the crazy scientists that experimented on themselves. When it comes to self-experimentation, few scientists are as prolific as JBS Haldane. This British Indian physician of the early 20th century conducted many experiments spanning a variety of fields, but he was particularly interested in the effects of deep-sea diving on sailors. He would often place himself in a decompression chamber, an awkward steel tube 4 feet in diameter, to simulate the effects and record the results he experienced firsthand. On one occasion, the effects of rapid decompression gave him an oxygen-induced seizure, leading him to crush several vertebrae in the process. Undeterred, he returned to the chamber and continued his experiments, in one case rupturing his eardrum when he accelerated the decompression process too fast. In later life, he was quoted saying, "If a hole remains in the eardrum, although one is somewhat deaf, one can blow tobacco smoke out of the ear in question, which is a social accomplishment." Sounds like he's tried that before. And what a worthwhile accomplishment. After years of research in 1984, Australian microbiologist Barry Marshall was convinced that he'd figured out what caused certain types of stomach ulcers, but he needed to prove it. The quickest way to do so was by infecting someone with a nasty strain of bacteria that he thought was responsible, called Helicobacter pylori. But the hospital ethics committee refused to permit him to test this hypothesis on anyone, so, you guessed it, he secretly injected a broth containing the bacteria in himself. Then he underwent an endoscopy where a doctor threads a tube down the esophagus to obtain a sample from the stomach lining, which confirmed that he'd contracted gastritis within days, much sooner than he'd expected. Despite the vomiting, ulcers, and in his wife's words, putrid breath, Marshall was overjoyed. After publishing his findings, he was awarded the Nobel Prize for his selfless disregard for his health and marriage. Hopefully, his next work will be devising the perfect breath mint. Next up, one of the most infamous names in science. Isaac Newton once said, "If I have seen further than others, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants." But after hearing about this next experiment, you'll wonder how he could have seen at all. The great 17th century scientist may be the most famous for his discovery of gravity, but he was also fascinated by the study of optics. His work with glass prisms revealed that color was a property of light and could be manipulated through refraction. But Newton wasn't content with merely understanding the properties of light. He wanted to know how humans perceive it in the first place, and how physically altering the eye could change this perception. So Newton took a large sewing needle known as a bodkin and inserted it, in his own words, "betwixt eye and bone as near to the backside of my eye as possible." Now, in case you didn't catch that, he stuck a needle into the gap between his eyeball and skull and wiggled it around to see what happened.
"This needs to stop now!"
As he manipulated the back of his eyeball, he noted down the colors and shapes the compressions caused him to see. These distortions were caused by compressing certain color receptors in the eye, but this wouldn't be discovered for many years. The father of modern science was not squeamish, as he went on to repeat the experiment several times to test the difference in light and dark surroundings. He claimed it was just science, but I suspect he was seeking some visual entertainment in an age before TV. Is it a car? Is it a plane? Is it really a good idea? Henry Smolinski was fed up with his engineering job and quit to pursue his one true dream: manufacturing the world's first commercially viable flying car. His plan consisted of pimping out a Ford Pinto, a 1970s car that became infamous for bursting into flames in any collision, with the wings and tail of a Cessna Skymaster, which is a small twin-engine aircraft. Despite there being some concern surrounding the considerable weight of the car in relation to its new wings, The business looked set to take off. After several successful test flights, the launch of commercial production was mere months away. But while Smolinski, alongside his company's co-founder, were taking the hybrid vehicle out for a further test flight, their dream came crashing down to earth. Due to a combination of poor welding and faulty locking mechanisms, the wing support failed, and the car plummeted to the ground. Sadly, both passenger and pilot died in the fiery blaze. And so did your chances of owning a flying car. Anyone who's experienced bedbugs will tell you they'd do anything to get rid of the critters. Bizarrely, that's not the case at all for Regine Gries. She and her husband are both biologists working to synthesize a pheromone that would lure the pests away from our furniture. However, the research process for the product isn't for the squeamish. Since 2006, Gries has subjected herself to 200,000 bedbug bites.
Damn!
She fills up to 5 jars at a time with 200 of the insects in each. And then she lays them against the length of her forearm and allows them to feast. Why? Well, she'd previously tried to keep the bugs fed on chicken and guinea pig blood, but the feeding processes had been fraught with complications and issues. So to simplify things, she decided to offer up her own blood for dinner. Bedbugs occasionally carry parasitic diseases like Chagas disease, which can cause heart failure. So the experiment isn't just gross, it's dangerous too. But it wasn't for nothing. Gries discovered that bedbugs release a pheromone made of multiple components that attracts the creatures and keeps them put. Now, by recreating the chemical makeup of this pheromone, we can use it in traps to lure the nippy creatures. Sucks for them. Now let's talk about another couple that took incredible risks for the sake of science. The work of Pierre and Marie Curie was instrumental to our understanding of radioactive materials. But, unfortunately for them, in the late 1800s and early 1900s, the scientific community knew very little about how dangerous these elements really were. Thanks to this lack of understanding, the amount of time the married couple spent surrounded by high levels of radioactivity was staggering. To put it in perspective, modern-day researchers can only handle the Curie's scientific papers while wearing protective clothing, and they're stored in lead-lined boxes the rest of the time. Pierre was particularly reckless when it came to irradiating himself. In 1903, he was preparing a presentation for the British Royal Institution. He wanted to display the effect of radium on the human body for possible use in cancer treatment, so in preparation, he taped a sample of radium against his arm for 10 hours, causing bad radiation burns on his skin. He presented his fresh-looking injury to amazed scientists, only to reveal that he had experimented over a month earlier. These types of experiments, the severity of which was not apparent at the time, were commonplace for the married couple and led to various health issues. Marie even kept a sample of radium on her desk as she enjoyed the way it glowed. While Marie would later suffer and die from radiation-related illnesses, Pierre died when he was run over by a horse and cart. Neither of them ever publicly acknowledged or perhaps realized the risks of radiation exposure. They only saw its potential in treating cancer. The motto of the U.S. Air Force advocates service before self, and Colonel John Stapp certainly lived by those words. Stapp made his name studying the effects of deceleration on his body. In 1945, little was known about what damage is done to the body in the event of an abrupt stop. This was something the military was very keen to understand to help its pilots. So, with the funding of the Wright Air Development Center, Stapp went around building a rocket sledge nicknamed the Gee-Whiz. Fully aware that he could seriously harm or even kill himself, Stapp strapped himself in and went to work. Over the next 10 years, he subjected himself to dangerous levels of G-force and speeds of up to 632 miles per hour, earning the title of the fastest man on Earth. These wild speeds were reached in as little as 5 seconds, and the sledge would often decelerate to a stop in 1 second. Of course, forces as high as 46.2 G didn't come without a cost. Fractured wrists, broken ribs, and even lost fillings were all in a day's work. And in 1954, Stopp even detached his retina, saying it felt somewhat like the extraction of a molar without anesthetic. Despite this, there was no stopping Stopp. He would carry out 29 crazy rides of this kind. After all that, he'd learned one very important thing. Humans can survive some seriously brutal stops, provided they've got seatbelts safely on. Seriously. Before then, it was worried that seatbelts might do more harm than good. However, this dangerous research paved the way for improved harness systems and airbags, and mandatory seatbelts in vehicles. So next time you strap, think of Stopp. Sometimes scientists do things that just leave us scratching our heads, and that sometimes leaves them scratching their own. In 1993, New York-based veterinarian Robert Lopez was posed a question by one of his clients. Can humans catch ear mites from their pets? After a brief period researching the phenomenon, he found that, not entirely surprisingly, a practical study had yet to be carried out. Lopez decided to step up to the plate, transferring some of the mites from his cat's ear into his own, using an infested cotton bud. He said he could immediately hear scratching as the tiny parasites headed down his ear canal, and soon he was struck by an intense itching sensation that didn't stop for weeks. It took over a month for Lopez to rid himself of the critters, only for him to repeat the experiment another 2 more times. Interestingly, the infestation resolved itself in a shorter time frame each time, not only proving that humans can catch ear mites from pets, but suggesting immunity could form over repeated exposure. He also discovered they had quite specific feeding times, noticing increased activity in his ear between 6 and 9 p.m. and midnight and 3 a.m., meaning the ear medication should be administered in the evening. He thoroughly answered that client's question and proved that when a scientist is curious, sometimes they just have to scratch that itch. Sometimes the solution to a health problem is very drastic and requires surgical intervention. Heart catheterization is a process where a tube is threaded through a large blood vessel to the heart, and it's one of the most intricate procedures in all of medicine. For many years, doctors believed it would kill a patient if performed. Enter 24-year-old Werner Forsman, fresh out of Berlin Medical School and full of confidence. The young surgeon was so sure that the procedure could be done that in 1929, he hatched a plan. He took a urinary catheter, stuck it in his arm, and then fed the needle 25 inches through a vein, observing its course through a small mirror held up by a nurse, eventually reaching his heart. Forsman then rushed over to the radiology department to take an X-ray of this never-before-seen procedure. The X-ray technician was, understandably, horrified. It took 26 years before the scientific community recognized Forsman's brave efforts, and he was eventually awarded the Nobel Prize. I just hope they awarded that X-ray technician a nice glass of water and a blanket after that traumatic experience. But you know what's even worse than taking an X-ray of a self-applied catheterization? Spiders. They are the worst. Black widow spider is feared for a reason, but it wasn't until 1933 that scientists fully understood quite how dangerous they really are. A professor named Alan Blair was studying the toxicology of the female black widow at Alabama University. He was particularly interested in the effect of their bite on humans. So throwing caution to the wind, he placed the spider on the end of his finger and let it bite him for 10 seconds. Over the next 24 hours, Blair was subjected to an intensely painful experience. He was taken to the hospital where he suffered tremors, vomiting, and a stiff, board-like abdomen and limbs. If you've ever had a cramp, just imagine that applied to your entire torso. Yeah, horrendous. He was finally discharged a full day later. The original intention of the experiment was to test whether repeated exposure to the toxins would build up immunity to the bite, but Blair said he, understandably, lacked the courage when faced with the prospect of going through that experience again. In 1961, Leonid Rogosov was the only doctor stationed at the Soviet-Russian Novolazarevskaya base in Antarctica. Weather conditions were particularly bad, and when a blizzard moved in over the area, nobody could get in or out of the building. When Rogozov began to experience severe pain in his lower abdomen, he soon identified his issue as appendicitis. But trapped inside, with the nearest Soviet base 1,000 miles away, getting another doctor to treat him was out of the question. Rogozov initially tried administering non-invasive measures, but when they didn't work, he had to resort to the only option. With 2 colleagues holding mirrors up so he could see what he was doing, the doctor began his self-appendectomy. Between the hours of 2 and 4 a.m., he performed surgery on his torso, successfully removing the inflamed organ. After 2 weeks in bed, he returned to his duties, and I can hardly trim my toenails. Leonid Rogozov undoubtedly falls on the spectrum of mad scientist. For most people, a black mamba's bite is a death sentence, but for Tim Fried, it's just a step in his morning routine. Every year, snakebites claim up to 140,000 lives and leave countless others permanently disabled. Frustrated by the lack of effective antivenoms, this former truck mechanic from Wisconsin decided to take matters into his own hands. Now, since the early 2000s, Fried has been deliberately injecting himself with venom from some of the world's deadliest snakes. The principle behind his daring experiment is known as Mithridatism, the ancient practice of building immunity through gradual exposure to toxins.
They were both poisoned.
Over 2 decades, he has endured more than 200 bites and 700 venom injections in his quest for resistance. But the road was far from smooth. In 2001, 2 cobra bites in quick succession put Fried in a coma for 4 days. Yet he refused to stop. Years later, he famously survived a black mamba bite on camera, a snake capable of killing within 30 minutes.
Make it fast. 2 more bites.
And then he did it again. And again.
2 bites. Nice.
Yeah, don't try this at home, kids. Fried's extreme efforts caught the eye of Dr. Jacob Glanville, the head of biotech company Centavax. Tests revealed that his blood did indeed carry the antibodies to neutralize fatal doses of the poison from multiple snake species, making it a potential universal antivenom. Today, as Centavax's director of herpetology, Fried's once reckless quest might help thousands. I'm just glad he volunteered, so the rest of us didn't have to. What would you do in the name of science? Well, if your name's Stubbins Firth, you'd voluntarily bathe in dying people's vomit. Let me explain. Back in 1801, a young medical student in Philadelphia set out to answer a burning question. How does yellow fever spread? Yellow fever's a nasty little virus that starts off like the flu, then turns your skin a worrying shade of mustard and your insides to mush. Understandably, this was a pretty pressing problem. At the time, most blamed bodily fluids, particularly vomit, for spreading the disease. Firth, however, had a bold theory: it wasn't contagious. And how better to prove it than by diving headfirst into other people's stomach contents? He started small by feeding animals with the notorious black vomit collected from dying patients. And when they failed to contract the disease, he upped the ante, rubbing it into his own open wounds, dripping it into his eyes, and even injecting globules of the stuff straight into his veins. Despite all this, he didn't catch yellow fever. But this wasn't enough for old Stubbins. Oh no, he went even further, gulping down spoonfuls of the horrific stuff and frying up 3 ounces in a pan and inhaling the steamy vapors like a gourmet spa treatment. Finally, because why stop there, he slept in a closet, turned vomit sauna, which unfortunately was exactly what it sounds like. Just a casual Friday night in the 19th century Philly. Somehow, Firth remained perfectly healthy and triumphantly declared yellow fever is not contagious. And he was technically right, just wildly unhelpful. Patients whose vomit he harvested were in the late stages of the disease with low viral loads. The real culprit would take another century and another batch of equally unhinged scientists to uncover. By the late 1800s, yellow fever had become one of the deadliest diseases in the Americas, killing more than 20,000 people in a single outbreak in 1878. A Cuban physician, Carlos Finlay, had suggested a little while back that perhaps mosquitoes were to blame. But without proof, his idea was dismissed as nonsense. Enter the U.S. Army Yellow Fever Commission, founded in 1900 and led by Major Walter Reed, who had a young assistant surgeon who took Finlay's hypothesis very, very seriously, Jesse Lazier. Now, how seriously, you ask? Well, instead of waiting for lab trials, Lazier had collected some mozzies that had recently dined on yellow fever patients, rolled up his own sleeve, and said, "Bite me." Within days, Lazier contracted the disease and died at just 34, leaving behind a wife and young children. His notes, published posthumously, confirmed Finlay's theory. Mosquitoes were the real culprits. That's something at least, buddy. These days, yellow fever is usually treatable, but mozzies haven't lost their edge. Just ask 27-year-old Bong Thet from Cambodia, whose leg ballooned to 5 times its normal size after leaving an infected mosquito bite untreated for years. Doctors eventually found that he'd contracted lymphatic filariasis, a rare disease caused by scratching through mozzie bites, which leads to microscopic worms entering the body and extreme swelling. So, yeah, maybe best not to scratch that itch. Meanwhile, across the world, in the turbulent heart of early 20th century Moscow, where revolution and science intertwined, one man was setting out to conquer death itself. Alexander Bogdanov. A physician, philosopher, and co-founder of the Bolshevik movement, Bogdanov turned from politics to a far more radical pursuit, immortality. By the 1920s, scientists were just starting to understand blood types, a breakthrough that made blood transfusions safe for the first time. Before then, it had been a bit of a gamble. Mixing incompatible blood types could be fatal. Bogdanov believed that blood carried more than oxygen and nutrients. He thought it contained the personal strengths of its donor. If so, transfusing young blood could rejuvenate the body and perhaps extend life. Therefore, between 1924 and 1928, he began transfusing himself with blood from his students, his wife, and allegedly Lenin's sister. Be grateful he wasn't in your social circle. Bogdanov claimed his vision and hair loss were improving, convinced that he was edging closer to eternal youth. But his final experiment destroyed all chances of achieving true Edward Cullen status. In 1928, he transfused himself with the blood from a 21-year-old student infected with tuberculosis and malaria, which predictably proved lethal. Within days, the man who sought immortality was dead, while his donor recovered and survived well into the 1980s. If I mention famous bike rides, you probably go straight to lycra-clad athletes racing across France, right? Well, some also celebrate a far shorter ride. One evening in April 1943, a 37-year-old chemist wobbled home through the streets of Basel and became a legend. In the spring of 1943, Swiss chemist Albert Hofmann was revisiting a forgotten lab compound at Sandoz Laboratories, lysergic acid diethylamide 25, or as it's more commonly known now, LSD. He had first synthesized it 5 years earlier from ergot, a toxic rye fungus. Initially shelved, Hofmann decided it deserved a second look, and during the process of resynthesis, he accidentally absorbed a tiny speck through his fingertips. Soon after, the world began to melt. He felt dizzy, restless, and then strangely euphoric? Fascinated rather than frightened, a few days later on April 19th, Hofmann did what any rational scientist wouldn't and deliberately ingested 0.25 milligrams. more than double what would be considered a full dose today. The result? According to him, a dreamlike state of fantastic pictures, extraordinary shapes, a kaleidoscopic play of colors. It could just as easily have been lethal. He had no idea how dangerous the substance might be. That evening, he just about managed to cycle home successfully under LSD's powerful influence, a surreal journey now known as Bicycle Day. Some scientists study plants, others find cures for diseases, and then there's Michael Smith, a social insect biologist at Cornell University who decided to pursue a pretty different research path. Where on the human body a bee sting hurts the most. In 2014, Smith decided the only suitable test subject for such an experiment was himself. He mapped out 25 body parts from armpits and fingertips to, eventually, his own gonads, and invited his winged friends to sting him repeatedly in each location. Imagine trying to pitch that to your college ethics board. The results were, enlightening. Surprisingly, the nostril topped the agony charts, while the knee pit, that little hollow behind your knee, earned the title of weirdest sensation. Smith's conclusion was both scientific and poetic. You're going to want more stings to the privates over the nose if you're forced to choose. Stings to the nostril were violent, immediately inducing sneezing, tears, and a copious flow of snot. I'll bear that in mind, Michael, if the dilemma arises. For his heroic self-sacrifice, he earned the 2015 Ig Nobel Prize in Physiology and Entomology, an award for research that makes you laugh, then think. I'm sure his study did have some scientific value on understanding pain perception, but I'm struggling to justify this one. I guess we'll just remember him as the world's bravest and most unhinged beekeeper. In 1912, French tailor Franz Reichelt decided to merge fashion with physics. His big idea, a wearable parachute suit. A silken contraption that would blossom into wings should a pilot have to leap from his aircraft and drift to safety. He began by tossing dummies wearing prototypes from his fifth-floor apartment window, then from 30-foot platforms. Let's just say the mannequins didn't quite stick the landing. But Reichelt pressed on. He wanted height, spectacle, and a dramatic debut. So he set his sights on the first deck of the Eiffel Tower. Authorities granted him permission, assuming that a mannequin would be taking the plunge, but last minute, before a crowd of journalists and gawkers, Reichelt stepped forward wearing his invention and announced he would jump himself. From 187 feet up, he leapt. I know what you're thinking. What an idiot. And you would be right. The parachute failed to open and Reichelt plummeted to his death, an event unfortunately immortalized on film. He became known as the Flying Tailor, even though, he didn't fly, and joined the myriad of other pioneers who lost their lives in the pursuit of safe human flight. In the summer of '61, beachgoers in North Queensland were plagued by a baffling illness. Swimmers would stagger ashore in agony, convulsing, vomiting, and clutching their chests as if Poseidon himself had it out for them. Doctors dubbed it Irukandji syndrome, after a local Aboriginal tribe, but the victims never saw their attacker. The task of solving the mystery fell to Dr. Jack Barnes, physician, toxicologist, and part-time maniac. Armed with nothing but a casserole dish and questionable judgment, Barnes waded into the surf and scooped up a pulsing jellyfish no bigger than a thumbnail. Convinced he'd found the offender, he decided to prove it on himself. With no volunteers handy, aside from his 10-year-old son Nick, Barnes let the creature sting the both of them, plus the local lifeguard, who joined in out of what I can only assume was peer pressure. Within minutes, all three were doubled over, writhing in agony. Pain relief was administered, the diagnosis was confirmed, and Karukaya Barnesi was named in Barnes's honor. Barnes called it a calculated risk. Sure, I'm Sure, that's why the research project earned him an honorable mention for the Darwin Awards for idiotic experimentation. Long before Frankenstein's monster jolted to life, one real man was already busy electrocuting himself in the name of science. When Alessandro Volta unveiled the first electric battery in 1800, Europe buzzed with excitement. Among those captivated was Johann Wilhelm Ritter, a 19-year-old German physicist who didn't just want to know what electricity could do, but what it felt like. While others zapped frog legs to study this strange new phenomenon of galvanism, the generation of electrical current, Ritter wired himself up instead. His tongue, nose, eyes, even, surprise, surprise, his genitals became test sites for his experimentation. Ritter kept detailed notes on each shock, the metallic tastes, the flashes of light behind his eyelids, and some more pleasurable sensations better left undescribed. But what began as curiosity quickly spiraled into obsession. Ritter pushed himself to endure longer and harsher exposures to electric current, dulling the pain with opium. The results were predictable: crippling headaches, muscle spasms, exhaustion, and even paralysis that once left his arm numb for 7 days. Still, he pressed on, lost in what he called the universe of his experiments. At one point, he even spoke of marrying the battery. Oh yes, sparks were flying indeed, until the romance ended, tragically. Years of loony self-experimentation wrecked his body and mind, and he died at just 33. When a puzzling new illness swept through the American South in the early 1900s, victims were left with scaly skin, crushing fatigue, and bouts of madness. Its name? Pellagra. Enthralled by the new germ theory, most doctors were certain pellagra was contagious, but physician Joseph Goldenberger noticed something others missed. The disease struck orphanages and asylums but spared their caretakers. The only real difference between the two? Diet. While the poor occupants of these establishments lived on corn mush, staff enjoyed meat and veg. Goldberger proposed something radical. Pellagra wasn't contagious. It was born of poverty and poor nutrition. To prove it, he conducted experiments on prisoners, feeding them corn-based meals until pellagra appeared, and then attempting to cure them with proper food. But the Southern leaders were skeptical, maybe because blaming cornbread threatened the entire region's economy. So, in 1916, Goldberger went all in, hosting, and this is no joke, filth parties. He, his wife, and a few other brave souls swallowed capsules made from pellagra patients' skin, urine, and even feces, then injected themselves with their blood for good measure. A bold way to get your daily nutrients, I'll say, but thankfully, it wasn't for nothing. None of the partygoers fell ill except, understandably, with diarrhea. Eventually, science caught up and pellagra was indeed traced to niacin deficiency. Thus, the disease faded from sight, taking Goldberg's fame with it. This nutter cured himself right out of the history books. Now, you could say that this next guy was destined to be a mad scientist. After all, his birthplace was none other than Castle Frankenstein, a real castle in Germany. Obsessed with unlocking immortality, German alchemist Johann Conrad Dippel spent his life chasing the mythical philosopher's stone, the promised cure for disease and death itself. Sound familiar? Dippel spent years boiling down animal blood, bones, and leather in search of eternal life until finally, in 1704, he produced a foul tar-like substance rich in ammonia, Dippel's oil. He proudly declared the pungent potion the elixir of life, a universal cure-all, and even tried to trade the recipe for ownership of Castle Frankenstein. Locals surprisingly weren't lining up for a sip, and, typical, he ignored the real breakthrough that his methods had produced: Prussian blue, the first modern synthetic pigment. Just a year after his proclamation, the toxic substances he was working with and ingesting led to death by chemical poisoning, And yeah, legend has it that Dippel's bizarre life and even stranger experiments inspired Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, a story about cheating death in honor of a man who did not. 200 years later, the spirit of absurd experimentation was still alive and well in Germany. In 1898, surgeon August Beer decided that the only way to truly understand the newest wonder drug, now here's a hint, it's synthesized from the coca plant, and its potential as a local anesthetic was to experience it firsthand. Having already injected 6 patients' spinal columns with this new surgical drug and receiving mixed results, Beer declared, "I must inject my own body." Armed with a syringe and an alarming amount of optimism, he enlisted his assistant, Dr. Hildebrandt. Their first attempt went awry, leaving Beer very aware of his legs. Undeterred, they swapped roles. Beer injected Hildebrandt instead, achieving perfect numbness and kicking off what might be the most questionable game of "Can you feel this?" in medical history. For the next 45 minutes, the intrepid duo tested the limits of sensation, tickling soles, bashing shins, burning a femur with a cigar, plucking pubic hairs, and even assessing, testicular endurance, for want of a better phrase. Hildebrandt, blissfully anesthetized, took it all like a champ. The two later toasted their success with dinner, wine, and more cigars. Their mild insanity laid the foundation for modern spinal anesthesia, though we don't use the same drug anymore. In the 1970s, doctors noticed a strange global pattern. In regions crawling with hookworms, allergies were rare. Wherever these parasites thrived, asthma and hay fever seemed to back off. Coincidence? British scientist David Pritchard thought not. By the early 2000s, researchers suspected hookworms might actually calm the immune system's overreactions by influencing regulatory T cells, the peacekeepers that stop your body from attacking itself. If parasites could keep things civil, Pritchard wondered perhaps they could ease allergies too. And someone had to test it. So in 2004, Pritchard rolled up his sleeve and infected himself with 50 hookworm larvae. They burrowed into his arm, triggering an unbearable itch before embarking on a grim, grand tour traveling through his bloodstream, lungs, and finally into his gut. There, they set up shop and began drinking his blood. That's a hard pass personally, but Pritchard was hoping his new roommates would soothe his immune system rather than his nerves, I guess. And the results were mixed. His asthma held firm, but his hay fever all but disappeared. Worth the risk? Well, you can decide that one for yourself. Still, his experiment sparked a whole new field: helminthic therapy, the use of worms to treat autoimmune disorders. In a quiet London lab in 1933, 2 doctors stood over a table, arms folded. Between them sat a set of scales, a notebook, and a coin ready to be flipped. Herbert Woolard and Edward Carmichael were exploring referred pain, the curious phenomenon where a problem in one part of the body causes discomfort elsewhere. Most organs would have sufficed as a test site, but they chose one of the most immediately accessible and, I might argue, stupid, the testicles. The experiment was straightforward, if not exactly dignified. One man, the details of who lost that coin toss remain mercifully unclear, lay spread eagle on a table, while the other, gently, I hope, placed a single one of the spread-eagled man's testicles onto a weighing scale. Weights were then added on top of the testicle incrementally. At 300 grams, the subject reported mild groin discomfort. At 650 grams, pain shot to the thighs and back. Beyond 2 pounds, the sensations were described as of a sickening character. Oh, great! Clearly, the testicle distress could dominate the entire nervous system, confirming what many men everywhere have long stated. Their observations were published in the medical journal Brain that September and remain the definitive study on the subject. I imagine because no one since has had the balls to repeat it. Mad? Sure. Reckless? Without a doubt, but thanks to them, we understand the world a little bit better, and we have some truly shocking stories to tell. Which of these scientists do you think was the bravest? And who was just plain stupid? Let me know down below, and thanks for watching.